9 drones, 1 target. 19 hours of silence that changed the Black Sea. April 14th, 2026, 2:07 a.m. The waters of South Bay, Sevastopol, lay still under a moonless sky. Inside a restored Soviet-era naval headquarters, a structure that had survived wars, revolutions, and 30 years of post-Soviet neglect. 12 senior officers of Russia's Black Sea Fleet were wrapping up their weekly operational briefing. They thought they were untouchable. 2 Tor-M2 air defense batteries formed an overlapping umbrella over the bay. A Pantsir-S1 short-range system sat on the adjacent promontory, its radar sweeping across every approach vector. The building's communications infrastructure had been upgraded twice since 2022, with hardened, encrypted satellite uplinks running directly to the General Staff in Moscow. In their minds, this was the most protected command node outside Russian territory itself. They were wrong, and in 40 seconds, they would start finding out exactly how wrong. By the time the last officer gathered his papers and reached for his coffee, 9 Ukrainian strike assets were already inbound, 4 naval surface drones and 5 aerial platforms, approaching from 2 opposite compass points simultaneously, synchronized to the second, designed not just to strike a building but to collapse the nervous system directing an entire fleet. This is the story of how Ukrainian Naval Intelligence planned, prepared, and executed one of the most operationally sophisticated drone strikes of the war, and why the results went far beyond what any satellite image could capture. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Welcome back. To understand why the strike on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters mattered, you have to understand what that building actually was. Not architecturally, tactically. The structure at the edge of South Bay in Sevastopol's historic naval district was not an administrative facility. It was the operational hub for everything Russia's Black Sea Fleet did in the Western theater of the war. Fleet positioning, patrol schedules, anti-drone corridor assignments, strike coordination with Russia's coastal defense missile batteries, the coordination of Kalibr cruise missile launches against Ukrainian cities. All of it flowed through the communications infrastructure inside that building, processed by the officers who met there weekly and transmitted upward to Moscow and laterally to naval units scattered across the Black Sea. Russian Naval Command had learned hard lessons earlier in the war. After the cruiser Moskva was struck by Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles in April 2022 and sank with enormous loss of life, the Black Sea Fleet retreated from forward positions. Command authority migrated from ships to shore. The Sevastopol headquarters grew more critical with every passing month as the fleet itself became more cautious, pulling back from Ukraine's coastal waters, relying on missile launches from protected positions well south of Crimea. By late 2025, this building wasn't just a headquarters. It was the brain of a fleet that refused to fight at sea but kept raining cruise missiles on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure from a safe distance. Which weapon system proved most decisive in the Sevastopol HQ strike? The naval surface drones that saturated the Pantsir, the aerial strike platforms that penetrated the gap, or the months of HUMINT collection that made targeting possible? Comment below with your analysis. The answer might surprise you. Ukrainian Naval Intelligence had been watching the headquarters building since at least mid-2025. Satellite imagery showed the Tor-M2 battery positions clearly. 2 launchers positioned north and east of the facility, their radar heads rotating in predictable patterns. The Pantsir-S1 on the promontory was newer, a 2024 deployment, positioned to close the southwestern approach gap the Tor batteries left open. On paper, the air defense coverage was close to comprehensive, but coverage maps and real-world radar performance are 2 different things. Here is the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and yet it turned out to be the hinge on which the entire operation swung. For 3 months, between September and December 2025, a Ukrainian HUMINT asset operating inside the Sevastopol Naval District had been doing something remarkably specific, mapping radar detection arcs from the inside, not from aerial observation or electronic intercept, from ground-level positions at known distances from the emitting systems, using signal strength data to calculate actual detection thresholds. The result contradicted what the satellite imagery suggested. The Pantsir's radar, while capable on paper of tracking targets in its assigned sector, had measurable performance degradation in the low-altitude northeastern approach corridor, a consequence of a topographic fold in the promontory's eastern face that created a radar shadow between approximately 4 and 11 meters above sea level. It wasn't a gap large enough to be obvious. It was exactly large enough to matter. 3 months of observation. 0 verified results for the first 6 weeks. The asset reported back twice to the coordination cell in Kyiv, and both times the response was the same: keep watching. It wasn't until the 8th week that the critical pattern emerged. Not just the radar performance data, but the weekly briefing schedule itself. Every Tuesday, consistently, the fleet's senior operational staff gathered inside the command wing. The timing varied slightly, sometimes 10 p.m., sometimes midnight, sometimes stretching past 2 a.m. But the day never changed. The location never changed. And the asset had now identified which portion of the building the command wing occupied and where the satellite antenna array sat on the roof above it. I spent considerable time going through the operational reporting that has since emerged from Ukrainian defense sources, and one detail kept pulling my attention: the 3-month timeline. Ukrainian Naval Intelligence didn't rush. They didn't strike when they first had the target located. They waited until they had something more valuable than a target location. They had a performance map of every sensor standing between their drones and the objective. The strike package Ukrainian Naval Intelligence assembled reflected the precision of that intelligence picture. 4 Magura V5 naval surface drones. Ukraine's domestically developed maritime strike platform, roughly 5 meters in length, carrying approximately 320 kilograms of explosive payload, capable of speeds up to 42 knots, with a radar cross-section engineered to frustrate exactly the kind of Pantsir systems defending the promontory. These 4 platforms would form the southwestern approach axis. Their mission was not to strike the headquarters. Their mission was to exist as radar targets, to be seen, to be tracked, to force the Pantsir's fire control system to commit its engagement cycles to the naval threat coming from the water. How many total strike assets did Ukraine deploy in the Sevastopol HQ operation? Was it A7 platforms total, B9 platforms total, or C13 platforms total? The answer is coming at the end of this video. The aerial strike package was more varied. 5 platforms in total, approaching from the northeast along the radar shadow corridor the asset had mapped. Sources indicate a combination of Ukrainian modified aerial systems, including what OSINT analysis suggests were Neptune derivative guidance packages mated to compact airframe designs built specifically for low-altitude terrain following flight. These were not commercial drone adaptations. They were purpose-built strike assets designed for exactly this kind of layered defense penetration. 3 of the 5 were designated as primary strike platforms. 2 were electronic support aircraft, tasked with monitoring emissions from the Pantsir and Tor systems and providing real-time data to the Naval Drone Coordination Cell on timing and engagement status. What's most surprising about this operation isn't the strike itself. It's the level of integration between naval and aerial platforms that Ukrainian forces demonstrated. Earlier in the war, surface drone operations and aerial strike operations were largely separate tracks, coordinated loosely but not fused in real time. By early 2026, the Drone Coordination Cell running this mission was operating both axes simultaneously from a single command node, with sub-second data links between naval and aerial platform controllers. That's a doctrinal leap most Western analysts hadn't fully credited Ukraine with achieving. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the version filtered through political press releases, but the tactical reality of what's happening in the field. The execution of the strike, when it came on April 14th, unfolded in a sequence that the Pantsir's operators never had a realistic chance of defeating. Not because they lacked capability, but because the decision tree they were forced to navigate had been built against them. At 2:04 a.m., the 4 Magura V5 naval surface drones, running at low speed to minimize acoustic signature, crossed the Pantsir's radar threshold from the southwest simultaneously. The system's fire control radar acquired all 4 contacts within seconds. This was by design. The contacts were real. The explosive payloads were real. Any one of the Magura platforms, if it reached the promontory at full speed, could inflict serious structural damage. The Pantsir operators had no rational choice but to engage, and the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It began tracking, prioritizing, and preparing to fire on the incoming naval threat. The engagement sequence that followed consumed precisely 40 seconds before the first Pantsir missiles launched. In those 40 seconds, the 5 aerial platforms entering from the northeast were already inside the radar shadow, flying between 7 and 9 meters above the ground. Threading the topographic fold the asset had spent 3 months mapping. They crossed the Pantsir's nominal detection threshold while its radar was locked onto the southwestern threat. Here's what happened in that window. Not the broad strokes, the specific sequence. 3 of the 5 aerial platforms were designated for strike. The lead drone tracked directly toward the command wing of the headquarters building. The second followed on a slightly offset azimuth, aimed at the same structural target but designed to maximize the probability of simultaneous impact if the first drone's approach triggered any automated close-in defensive response. The third platform carried a different warhead configuration, fragmentation optimized, targeted specifically at the satellite antenna array on the roof. The 2 electronic support platforms held position outside the engagement zone, their emissions intelligence feeding back to the coordination cell in real time. The first aerial drone struck the command wing at 2:07 a.m., 11 seconds before the Pantsir achieved its first successful engagement against the naval surface platforms to the southwest. The second strike drone impacted the command wing 3 seconds later. The third platform struck the antenna array on the roof at 2:07 a.m. and 40 seconds, as the Pantsir was already pivoting to reacquire threats. The Pantsir engaged 2 of the Magura naval drones successfully. 1 detonated on approach before reaching the promontory. 1 was damaged and lost steering, eventually running aground. The other 2 naval drones, their decoy mission complete, withdrew at full speed and were recovered. The explosion that tore through the command wing of the Black Sea Fleet headquarters was heard across South Bay. Security footage from surrounding facilities, later analyzed by Ukrainian intelligence, showed the structural collapse of a significant portion of the building's upper floor on the command wing side. The antenna array on the roof was completely destroyed. And at 2:08 a.m., the encrypted satellite uplink connecting Black Sea Fleet Operational Command to Moscow went dark. The Pantsir system on the promontory continued operating. The Tor-M2 batteries were undamaged. The harbor security vessels began moving immediately. But none of that mattered, because the communications infrastructure those assets were supposed to coordinate through no longer existed, if you believe that tactics. Not numbers, not budget, not political will. Win wars, type Steelfront in the comments. Because what Ukraine demonstrated at Sevastopol was precise tactical thinking applied with surgical execution. The 19 hours that followed the strike represent something that hadn't happened to the Black Sea Fleet since the war began. Complete operational communications blackout. Naval patrol boats operating in the western Black Sea that night reported, according to intercepted communications later analyzed by Ukrainian signals intelligence, confusion and silence in equal measure. The standard hourly coordination traffic from Sevastopol never came. Emergency frequencies produced no command traffic. Fleet units attempted to reach the headquarters through backup frequencies and received nothing. Russian naval forces in the Black Sea have always operated with a degree of rigidity that reflects their Soviet doctrinal inheritance. Command authority flows vertically, and units without command traffic default to their last received orders rather than exercising independent initiative. On the night of April 14, 2026, that rigidity became a catastrophic vulnerability. Patrol boats that should have been repositioning in response to detected Ukrainian naval activity in the western Black Sea instead held to their last assigned sectors. Coastal defense missile battery crews that should have received updated threat assessments received nothing. The coordination that should have translated raw sensor data into tactical responses never occurred, because the node that performed that translation was gone. Ukrainian drone boat operations that night. 3 separate missions involving Magura V5 platforms operating against Russian resupply routes in the western Black Sea reported something they had never reported before: no coordinated Russian response. Vessels that on previous operations had faced active direction from Sevastopol Command, with patrol boats repositioning to intercept and coastal defense batteries putting targeting radar on active scan. instead encountered the maritime equivalent of an unmanned battlefield. The drone boats completed their missions and withdrew without meaningful interference. Here's the take that's probably going to generate some disagreement. The Russian decision to concentrate fleet command authority in a single shore-based facility, rather than distributing it across multiple hardened nodes with genuine redundancy, wasn't just a tactical error. It was a systemic leadership failure that reflects something deeper about how Russian military command culture actually functions. Centralization feels like control. In a modern, contested environment with precision strike capabilities reaching deep into supposedly protected rear areas, centralization is a death sentence. What this operation reveals is how Ukrainian military thinking has evolved over 4 years of full-scale war. Ukraine began this conflict improvising defense against a dramatically larger force. By April 2026, Ukrainian Naval Intelligence was planning and executing strike operations of a complexity and integration that would challenge any military in the world. The HUMINT collection, the radar performance mapping, the dual-axis approach designed to force a predictable defensive response, the precise synchronization of naval and aerial platforms. None of this is improvised. All of it reflects an institutional learning curve that the Russian military, despite enormous resources, demonstrably has not matched. The aftermath assessment, when Ukrainian intelligence pieced together what the strike had achieved, went beyond the physical damage. The structural collapse of the command wing, combined with the antenna array destruction, meant that even after Russian repair teams restored basic communications capability 19 hours later, the databases, planning materials, and operational records stored in that wing were gone. Ukrainian sources, speaking to defense analysts in late April 2026, described the strike as having set back Black Sea Fleet operational planning by a period they were reluctant to specify. But the context made clear that weeks, not days, was the working assumption. Would you have authorized the 3-month HUMINT collection timeline if you were commanding this operation? Or would the pressure to strike when the target was first identified have won out? The answer to that question is the difference between a strike that damages a building and a strike that collapses a command structure. Intercepted Russian communications from the 24 hours after the strike, fragments of which were later shared with Ukrainian defense journalists, painted a picture of institutional panic that Russian military culture typically suppresses. Officers communicating on backup frequencies showed confusion not just about what had happened, but about who now held authority. In the absence of the command node, competing chains of authority were asserting themselves simultaneously. One intercept fragment described a heated dispute between fleet operations staff over whether to activate the secondary command protocol, suggesting that the protocol existed but had never been rehearsed sufficiently for anyone to be certain they were authorized to invoke it. One detail from the post-strike assessment stayed with me. The Ukrainian drone boats operating that night submitted standard after-action reports the following morning. In the section designated for threat contacts and defensive responses encountered, 3 of the 4 boat commanders left the field blank. In 4 years of operations against the Black Sea Fleet, that had never happened before. Combat footage verification from the hours following the strike, combined with satellite imagery acquired by commercial operators and analyzed by multiple OSINT organizations, confirmed the structural damage to the command wing of the headquarters building. Analysts from at least 4 organizations independently assessed that the upper floor of the command wing had experienced near-total structural collapse in the area consistent with the reported impact points. The antenna array on the roof was confirmed destroyed. Russian repair activity visible in subsequent satellite passes indicated an emergency response. Military vehicles and equipment concentrated at the site within hours, suggesting a priority recovery operation rather than a standard damage assessment. The Pantsir system on the promontory was observed active and operational in imagery taken the day after the strike. The Tor-M2 batteries were repositioned slightly, a tactical adjustment that analysts read as a response to the recognition that the approach corridor had been mapped and exploited. Neither adjustment addressed the fundamental vulnerability the strike had exposed, that the air defense systems protecting the headquarters could be saturated from one direction while precision strike assets entered from another, provided the approach corridor geometry had been studied in sufficient detail. Will Ukraine continue developing these split-axis, intelligence-led strike operations against command nodes rather than frontline assets? Comment yes if you think this becomes the defining strike doctrine of the next phase of the war, or no if you think Russian counter-adaptation will close this window. We read every comment. Real tactics, real consequences, steel front. Russian losses from the strike itself, in the conventional military accounting sense, were not the defining metric. No ships were sunk, no aircraft were destroyed, no large formations of soldiers were killed. The losses that mattered were institutional. 12 hours of direct targeting time lost against Ukrainian naval operations, 19 hours of fleet communications blackout, an unknown but significant volume of operational planning material destroyed in the command wing collapse, and, perhaps most importantly, a demonstrated penetration of what Russian command had believed was a comprehensively defended facility. The psychological impact on Russian Black Sea Fleet command culture, while impossible to measure precisely, should not be underestimated. Command staffs that believe their facilities are vulnerable do not function the same way as those who believe they are protected. The post-strike rotation of headquarters functions to additional distributed sites, observed in satellite imagery analysis through May 2026, was exactly the kind of resource-consuming dispersal that degrades operational efficiency even without further strikes. Ukraine had forced the Russian Fleet Command to spend time, resources, and cognitive bandwidth on defensive reorganization rather than offensive coordination. The Sevastopol headquarters strike will be studied in military doctrine programs for what it demonstrates about the relationship between intelligence collection timelines and strike effectiveness. The temptation, when a high-value target is identified, is to strike immediately. Ukrainian Naval Intelligence did the opposite. They identified the target early and spent 3 months making the strike as precise and as devastating as possible. That patience, institutionally demanding, operationally complex to maintain, is the lesson that most militaries, with their preference for rapid action, will struggle to absorb. The strike also demonstrated the maturation of Ukraine's unmanned systems integration. The ability to synchronize naval surface platforms and aerial strike platforms in a coordinated dual-axis approach, with real-time emissions intelligence feeding back to the coordination cell, was not present in Ukrainian operations in 2022 or 2023. It reflects both the development of indigenous systems, the Magura V5 and its derivative platforms, and the integration of Western-supplied electronic support capabilities that gave the coordination cell the sensor picture necessary to execute the timing sequence with precision. The 40-second Pantsir engagement window was not an estimate. It was a calculated parameter that Ukrainian planners knew they could exploit because they understood, with measured precision, how the Pantsir's fire control system would respond to the threat it was presented with. Now, the answer to the question from earlier in this video. How many total strike assets did Ukraine deploy in the Sevastopol HQ operation? The answer is B, 9 platforms total. 4 Magura V5 naval surface drones forming the southwestern approach axis, tasked with saturating the Pantsir's tracking radar, and 5 aerial platforms. 3 primary strike drones and 2 electronic support aircraft, forming the northeastern approach axis along the radar shadow corridor. Not 7, not 13. 9 assets, precisely coordinated, each with a defined mission role in a sequence that had been war-gamed against every realistic defensive response scenario the Pantsir and Tor-M2 combination could generate. 2 of the 4 naval surface drones were lost or damaged during the engagement, performing their designated mission of forcing Pantsir commitment. All 3 aerial strike drones reached their targets. The electronic support platforms withdrew intact. By any operational accounting, the strike achieved its objectives at a cost the Ukrainian Navy's drone coordination cell assessed as acceptable for the effect delivered. So, was the 3-month HUMINT collection timeline the right call? Looking at what it enabled, the radar performance mapping that made the northeastern approach corridor usable, the briefing schedule intelligence that ensured the command staff was present, the structural intelligence that allowed precise warhead placement against the antenna array. The answer seems clear. A strike launched when the target was first identified in mid-2025 would have damaged a building. The strike executed in April 2026 destroyed a command node. Could Russian air defense have prevented this with different deployment decisions? Specifically, if the Pantsir had been positioned to cover the northeastern approach rather than the southwestern, Possibly. But covering the northeastern approach would have left the southwestern corridor open. Any single-layer air defense solution around that facility was exploitable once the approach geometry had been studied from the ground. And what would you have done differently? If you were commanding the Russian air defense network around Sevastopol, knowing that a HUMINT asset had spent 3 months mapping your radar arcs from the inside, with no way to detect that collection was occurring? That question doesn't have a clean answer, and that's the point. The asymmetry of modern warfare, where a patient, precise adversary can study a defended target for months and then strike with near-surgical accuracy, doesn't yield to traditional defensive responses. The Pantsir worked exactly as designed. The Tor-M2 batteries were fully operational. The encrypted communications infrastructure was hardened. None of it was sufficient because the strike was designed around all of it. Subscribe to Steelfront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The drone warfare era has produced no cleaner example of intelligence-led precision strike than what Ukraine executed against the Black Sea Fleet headquarters on April 14, 2026. And the war is not over. The waters of South Bay are quiet now. The headquarters building stands, partially. Russian repair crews have done what repair crews do. Communications have been restored. A new antenna array sits where the old one was destroyed. But somewhere in the tactical planning cells of Ukrainian Naval Intelligence, the next operation is already in development. The next radar arc is already being measured. The next window is already being calculated. The wrecks of what burned that night aren't visible on the water, but the 19 hours of silence that followed. The fleet without a brain, the patrol boats without direction, the drone boats running unopposed through the dark. Those consequences remain in every after-action report filed since April 2026. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes institutional overconfidence without mercy. Stay vigilant.